Thank you. Okay, so what we're presenting today then is a bit of research that we've been doing as a group. And in a moment, Johnny will talk you through our kind of research process. But it's really kind of about the idea of bioregional thought, bioregions, and bioregionalism. And the way we've kind of organized this is we're going to talk through what we think we've found out so far. And we've put in a couple of moments for you as a group to ask us questions or kind of give your responses to what you think about what we think so far. So this is all kind of early days. We've done a series of interviews and some kind of reflections of our own, but it's really early kind of analysis. So all of your kind of thoughts and opinions we really welcomed at this point. Ooh, sorry, bit of a delay. So quickly we can just introduce ourselves. So you've all met me a few times, but I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, and my research is really focused on this idea of bioregioning. And the way I came into this topic was through thinking about kind of next economy, post-capitalism, and different ways of living effectively. But yeah, you've all heard a little bit about me. A lot of my work has been with the Tayside bioregion, but also with Glenn, looking at the Casco Bay bioregion in America. But maybe I could pass over to Maria to say hello.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for having us. I'm Maria. I'm a PhD student in Iceland at the Agricultural University, and I know Ella and Johnny from these sort of bioregional exploratory research projects that we've been doing with Glenn. In different bioregions, really, and I've heard a lot about bioregions, especially in the UK and in America from my work with Glenn. And we've basically done a little bit of an exploratory research into a possibility or the thought of bioregioning and if it fits with Iceland, because I'm working on my PhD project which looks at marine planning and participatory methods and participation of communities in that sphere. And I saw it a little bit as maybe a way to think about getting communities engaged in even just environmental questions at all, and getting people to talk about this kind of stuff more in depth. A little bit of I've heard a little bit something like this before today from one of you. I don't remember who said it, but yeah, just maybe getting people to talk. And this was kind of my route into bioregioning, and if the concept could be useful and what we could do with it in Iceland. So it seems to be quite new as a concept in Iceland. Nobody else is really doing that as far as I know. So for the Icelandic side is really first steps. And yeah, with Ella and Johnny and Sam, mainly we're looking into kind of concepts of bioregions and bioregionalism and how it's used in different places and what we can learn from that.
Great. Johnny, do you want to say hello?
Sure. So hello everyone, very happy to be here. I've met a few of you, but there's some of you who I've not bumped into before. So I'm Johnny from the UK. I live in Derbyshire, and the bulk of my work is based around systems transformation. And I'm really trying to sort of equip myself with skills, transformational skills such as transformational theory, systems thinking, systems mapping, futures thinking, economic infrastructure, just to be able to learn how I can apply all of these different approaches to industries and regions around the world. But one of the most powerful things that I've found within this is place-based transformation, and specifically bioregions, which is how I came into this space, I guess. So yeah, very happy to be here, and I guess you'll hear more in a second of what we've been doing. And Sam Wern, who isn't here, is also a PhD student from Australia.
Yeah, and Sam, he's a practitioner as well. So our group, even though today we're kind of half PhD students, half not, it is a group which has been a mixture of practitioners and academics. So we've kind of come with this view of producing something that is not just useful in an academic sense, but is useful for people who are actually out there doing the work on the ground, which is why it was important to bring it to you at this point, so that you can start feeding back on what we've done. Here we go. Johnny, if you want me to change slides or anything, let me know.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. So as Maria mentioned, we were, as a group, convened by Glenn Page out of Portland, Maine. And as some of you who know Glenn will know that he's a fantastic convener. So Glenn was very aware that there were quite a few younger individuals around the world, and you can see on this map, it sort of highlights where we're placed, that had an interest in bioregions and bioregioning from varied backgrounds. And the group consisted, over the time that we were convened, of 13 researchers and practitioners. And now there's 4 of us, the 4 that were just introduced, that we're trying to turn our experiences into a piece of research. And we all had an interest in bioregioning or bioregions in some way or another. But from the initial conversations that we had, we realized that our motivations were completely different in some cases, and our understanding of bioregions were completely different, largely to the geographic displacement of us, but just down to our different experiences. So we came up with some questions to answer as a group, and these were some of the ones that you can see on screen. So were we all talking about the same thing? Why are bioregions useful to us, and what are the challenges? And just a point to add that even though Glenn convened us as a group, he sort of convened us and then took a step back and allowed us to really create our own agenda, and bring forward some questions that we wanted to approach. So if you could change the slide, Ella. So once we put forward these questions, we wanted to talk through how we were going to approach them. And we started with using an online interactive whiteboard called Mirror Boards to just map our own, initially just map our own understanding. So each of us, when we thought of bioregions, what did we mean? What were we talking about individually? And that really allowed us to recognize the differences that we were holding and the different perspectives that we were holding, and allowed us to notice that, because initially I think it was like we saw the differences as, oh no, that's really worrying. Like, how can we be here in a group that's titled bioregions and we don't necessarily think the same thing? But just mapping it out allowed us to see the positives in the different perspectives that we were holding. And then what we then did was to map our key influences. So we have this passion and this understanding of bioregions, but where has that come from? Who were the key individuals potentially who had taught us about bioregioning? Who were the key individuals that we looked up to? Who were those individuals whose work we found really powerful? And we just, again, put them into this map to allow us to start researching those different individuals. And once we'd done that, we started to set up interviews with these people to just explore with them where their own passions came from and what their own understandings were of bioregioning, to help us to develop the conversations that we'd already have. And the aims of these interviews were to produce something useful for people that were coming into this space, and to allow people to understand the different forms that bioregioning, the term bioregioning, can take, so that people can easily situate themselves when they come into this space. And Ella is going to take you through some of the outputs of this work that we found so far. So over to you, Ella.
Thanks, Johnny. And yeah, just to kind of reiterate, we really want to produce something that's not just going to sit in academic spaces, but what we're going to show to you now is kind of really early reflections. So, it's quite tentative. We haven't necessarily got the language that we want to use yet, but we thought it was useful to kind of sense check what we thought so far. So the first thing we started thinking about was kind of like the basic definitions. So what were people talking about? And the first thing was actually saying there's a difference between talking about a bioregion and then talking about bioregionalism or bioregioning or bioregional thought, which is, kind of a way of approaching landscape and approaching kind of action. Whereas when we're talking about bioregions, that is talking about a kind of specific scale But as I'll go on to explain in a minute, that definition itself can be quite broad. But actually, what we found was that although people who are using bioregionalism or bioregioning as a way of thinking, there were also people who have been using bioregions without actually the ism coming with it. So they were saying actually bioregions are really useful, but as a scale, but the kind of way of thinking about bioregionalism isn't useful. So actually that was quite an interesting distinction, to be like, actually some people are using one and not the other, even though it seems like they should go together. The other thing that was really interesting to us was the kind of difference between saying that there's a bioregion, which is something that exists in nature. We can go out and find it. It's something that's very clearly there that exists without humans, versus thinking about bioregions, which are as a kind of human construction, saying this is a human way of thinking about landscape, that we put it on a map and it's really useful, but it's not something that necessarily exists in nature apart from humans. So yeah, that's kind of two slightly different ways of thinking about it, which is quite interesting to start pulling out in interviews to say, actually, is this something that people see as like a foundational part of nature, or is it just something which is a useful tool for thinking? The third thing is kind of a spectrum of how fuzzy people see the boundaries of bioregions. Is it something that you can clearly draw a line around? Is it something that's a bit fuzzy? Is it something that we can kind of talk about at one scale for one purpose, or a slightly different kind of scale or boundary for another purpose? And again, you've got a kind of spectrum of people being like, actually, it is quite fuzzy, and we can be quite kind of pragmatic about where we draw that boundary, versus actually, no, it's something that we can clearly put on a map and draw a line around. This is a bioregion. And then finally, related to that is this kind of pragmatic definition of bioregions, being like, actually, this is something that is really useful, that we can mobilize for certain reasons, but we don't have to kind of worry too much about definitions. Actually, what it is it's something that we find a utility for, and that's enough. So, and there's more kind of nuance to the definitions as well that I think will come out, but those were kind of our initial reflections on what we thought was really interesting, is that there's slight kind of tensions and differences between how people are understanding bioregions and bioregional thoughts, and they're closely related, but you might find yourself situated in slightly different places on that. And also that might move throughout time, or depending on what you're doing as well. But rather than it being a really clear agreed definition that everyone's using, that kind of moves around. And this is kind of related to what we've called pathways to kind of bioregionalism, or kind of the critiques that lead people to thinking in bioregional ways. And again, I've kind of pulled out the four main ones, or the four ones that we've kind of found straight away. But the first is a kind of systems thinking type approach. So what this pathway to bioregional thinking is about is saying that actually we've got a lot of environmental and social problems that come from a lack of understanding of systems, and that we need to think systemically in order to make interventions that are going to solve problems. So that's kind of about a lack of knowledge and understanding of a whole system of an area. The second one is about this idea of reconnecting with nature, and our kind of loss of connection with nature being the cause of problems. So with that could be things like losing traditional knowledge, not knowing how to actually live in a place is something that causes problems. And that bioregional action is about sort of falling in love with place again and learning how to look after it and kind of wanting to be a steward of that place. The third one is about kind of globalization versus localization, and saying that globalization is a force which has caused environmental and social problems because it's about universalizing a specific way of living. And that means that we don't, again, know how to live in the places where we actually live. And then the final one is about the human boundaries that we draw around things, and that leading to exploitation and extraction. And being that the way that we divide up maps or the way that we draw a line between human and nature is a cause of extraction and exploitation, because it changes the way that we see things. So actually, if we take away those human boundaries and return to more naturally defined boundaries, we can learn how to kind of see how to live in place. And what was really interesting is that no one just came from one of these pathways. Everyone that we spoke to kind of drew on like several of these or all of these or a couple of these. No one just had one critique, which was the only thing that inspired this way of thinking. So at this point, we thought we'd kind of ask you what you thought about these definitions and then about these kind of pathways and critiques. So do they resonate with you? Are there other things that we've missed? Are there any of these kind of pathways or critiques or definitions that you kind of think are spot on? So I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment and hand over to you to get your responses. Feel free to just jump in.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll just kind of very quickly think, I think the one thing you could look at is this whole idea of the global commons and how we manage the global commons locally, and bioregions as being a container, if you like, for stewarding the global commons locally. So by the global commons, I mean things like fresh water, air, soil health, forests, fish stocks, all of these things. I hate calling it fish stocks, just fish. The kind of the health of places. And some people would look at that through a kind of allocations lens, but other people would say that there's an absolute value that we can put on the health of these systems. So in many cases, is a kind of elision between your four different ways of looking at bioregions that you identified, because you could also say that natural systems are also global commons, which can only probably be managed locally. I mean, I still don't know how to figure out how to manage the global commons globally, but maybe somebody will. Sorry, Christopher, I think I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. No, I was very much enjoying your presentation. When you got to that slide, it was just all of that was resonating very strongly. So as it relates to the question about, you know, what whether you think that you've nailed it or not, that I mean, Isabel, fantastic addition. But I do think those 4 points were very strong for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was thinking about my pathway to bioregioning, apart from being introduced to it by some very inspiring people who are on this call. And I felt a sense of crisis, and I needed to do something about it. And so for me, the sense of crisis was very much part of the pathway. And I don't know how you could capture that.
And when you're thinking about crisis in that way, did any part of that crisis link to one of those four? Or is it just an overwhelming sense of needing to do something and the bioregion is the place that I could do that?
Yeah, I think probably for me, it was needing to do something. And then the concept that I felt most kinship with was the bioregioning one.
So was that something leading to agency? Do you think bioregions in some way? Yeah,
actually, that's a really good way of pointing that, underlining that. Definitely.
Perhaps I'd jump in at that point. I suppose I was feeling a need for action, overwhelmed by the scale of the problem. It's planetary, isn't it? And was, you know, browsing the internet and found the South Devon bioregion and contacted Isabel, who put me in touch with Paul. That's how we got started, as you might know. So there's something about the very local, yes, that's important, but is kind of too small. Global's too enormous. So bioregion seems to be a level at which it's a scale of action that makes sense and is useful. I like the fact that, for me at least, a river watershed kind of makes sense, I think, in nature. And if you help people see that they're dependent on the water in this place for their lives, then it connects them back to soil, air, water. And I also like an aspect of bioregional thinking whereby you're trying to live within the carrying capacity of the bioregion. And one little thread maybe didn't quite pull out in your list is that I think it's important for me, the term regeneration, which I know it gets hijacked, but it's too late for mere sustainability now. We are so wrecking the joint that we need to regenerate it. That would be my thoughts.
John, do you want to add to that? Yeah.
Yes, just that, like I think what Richard was just saying, I came to the subject because I spent half of, or 3/4 of my life not understanding how I was supposed to relate to something called the climate crisis. And when I wasn't befuddled by that, I said, what does this word sustainability mean? It's so abstract. And bioregion and bioregioning was the first moment in which you could kind of draw a picture of where one could be active. So for me, it's very importantly, it's the limits of where you can take practical action rather than just think about things. And the other good thing about bioregioning I've discovered since then is that it's not necessary to have for me, a clear definition. You can have a discussion about where the bioregion does or doesn't end, but that subject of having a discussion, including with people who might disagree with you, you then create a shared understanding of a place or region just through the process of looking at what's there and where bits kind of end or not. So it's the ing word, which I learned, I think, from Isabel, whoever came up with the ing word was very important because it's not a kind of fixed entity. It's an activity, a process that people get value from in different ways.
Anthony.
Great. Well, thank you for all these things. For me, that the bioregioning contains a spiritual element, and this path for human connection with nature. Bioregioning seems to, we have to rethink the whole way we are looking at our existence on this planet, and that spiritual recognition of total interconnectedness, for me, is very well expressed in the bioregion. And just to add to the step that brought me to bioregioning was very much driven by the incapacity of Oxford as a city to connect with its region. It just tramples on the region. This greedy university that wants to build over everything and turn it into Silicon Valley. It makes me very angry, but reaching out to people in Oxford that actually want to connect to the rest of the region was very important. And the thing is encapsulated at the moment by the City Council and the County Council getting together to spend £135 million on building a concrete flood alleviation channel, which is going to wreck some very important ecology. When it's just a complete failure to look at the watershed as a whole, and for a tenth of that sum, they could do 50 natural flood alleviation schemes upstream and benefit the ecology. So bridging this disconnect is what the bioregion really needs to get traction for. We're a long way from getting traction in the Thames headwaters, but that's my little contribution.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and that's actually a perfect. Oh, sorry, John, did you want to jump in? You're on mute, John.
I'm trying to kind of practice a mantra called no critique without a practical action that corresponds to it. So I think that the point about bioregioning is that every time you have an argument, for example, with a university concreting over a fen, one could say, why not devote some of that energy to reconnecting with nature? And then you have a discussion about how that could happen. And I think that a large number of people in these organizations very badly want that also, but they have no real clear idea how to do it. So bioregioning as a practice, and not just a good idea, gives people a way to start, which I think is pretty powerful.
Yeah, brilliant. And that kind of segues really nicely into our next section. So I'll just share my screen again. Because the next part we were thinking about is actually what people are doing in response to this way of thinking. So what is the actual work that people are doing, and how does that relate to the idea of a bioregion? And this is the section that we haven't developed a huge amount. It was kind of just immediate responses to what we've seen. So some of this, like you say, is the bioregion is a strategic scale, where it's a scale where it's big enough to feel like it's making a difference, but small enough so that we can understand how our actions are actually having an impact. So it's quite a strategic scale to work at. There's also quite a lot of tension in the interviews about building regional and global networks. And I think this kind of relates to what you were saying, Isabel, as well, about managing global commons locally. So it's this balance between dealing with local issues and connecting globally with issues. And actually, sometimes people are saying it's really helpful to connect to global networks, but at some point that comes at a cost, or because it gets to the point where you spend too much time engaging with wider networks and you lose focus on what you're doing locally. So there's a real balance of that. The other one that's come out is, which was a real surprise to me, is this idea of health and bioregions. And that came through in quite a lot of the interviews, is that human health or planetary health can be a real connector in taking this idea of bioregions and bioregionalism and turning that either to policy or to helping people understand what it is you're talking about. Health is quite a powerful tool and a powerful language to do that in. That was something that really surprised me anyway. The other one is a way of building local networks. And I think that's come through quite strongly in all of your responses, and the kind of check-ins at the start as well, as bioregions being a tool for saying, actually, this is our literal common ground. You know, it might be lots of different projects doing lots of different things, but they are connected through this bioregion. And then finally, one thing that came out really strongly was that the work needs to actually be, you know, you need to actually be doing the work. You can't just be talking about ideas like we're doing today. But what's important is that it's actually doing something, and that bioregioning or bioregional thought is useful when it translates into actually doing something. And that's something that came through repeatedly in the interviews. And then kind of related to this as well was the kind of tensions and difficulties with thinking bioregionally. So the first one, and these kind of came out in different ways in different interviews and through our own personal reflections. But the first one is kind of the indigenous and the colonial context of bioregioning. And that was in lots of different ways. So one of them is like a big question of, what does it mean to belong to a place? Who gets to belong, who counts, who gets included and who gets excluded? But there's also a kind of colonial context which came through, particularly talking to some of our South and Central American colleagues, which was saying, actually, this idea of bioregioning is a Western idea, which is then being applied in places like in the global South, where they have other words or other concepts or different understandings of place. And it's quite easy to say, oh, that's bioregionalism, and we're going to call it that, rather than engaging with what those other concepts or other ways of working or other ways of living could be. The second one was about sustainability of cities, and to what extent could you do bioregioning or live bioregionally in cities? And again, there was a kind of spectrum of responses to this. And in one of the interviews in particular, the response to that was, it's not possible. We can't live bioregionally in cities. And then at other points we're saying actually bioregions is a useful way of connecting cities to their surrounding areas, and that's where it can be really powerful. So that was quite a strong tension in the interviews that we did. The third one came particularly through kind of talking to Australian colleagues about actually what is it we're trying to do? Is it about restoring something that existed before humans were there? And kind of in the Australian work, there was a real strong sense that there is still a landscape that existed before humans, and that should be kind of the goal. And that is what we should be working towards. And we can start talking about what a landscape is like without humans. And then in other contexts, it wasn't that at all. It was saying, how do we live regeneratively with humans and non-humans? And then in other interviews, it came out completely the other end of the spectrum, which was saying, we are living and trying to work towards post-Holocene living. So what's going to happen once the climate collapse has happened? We are the future experiments. We are experimenting with what this could be in the future. And actually, we're almost abandoning the world as it is now. We're living in expectation of what's coming next. And then the final real strong tension was about actually the separation of human and nature, and saying, you know, is bioregional thought a way of kind of collapsing that difference between humans and nature, and saying, you know, we are just part of this system, and to what extent can it sort of reinforce that by saying this is like a human way of seeing landscape still. And again, that was something that came through really strongly in the difference between the Australian and the European way of thinking. So it's a shame that Sam can't be here to talk about this a little bit more, but I'm sure he'd be interested in hearing your responses to this. So again, I'll stop sharing in a second. And really, this is just to get your reflections on kind of how you feel about these tensions. Like, are there any other kind of difficulties that you find when you're using this? And then how do you think your work kind of draws on the idea of bioregions and bioregional thinking? So let me stop sharing. There we go. So I'll turn over to you again. Daniel.
Yeah, so I just wondered if this is a parallel universe to my 40 plus years spent as a town and country planner. The first point is, it is town and country planning, although for all that time and my predecessors did town planning and the country was a residual. But having read the Green Paper today, we've got this juggernaut coming towards us that suddenly the government either required to or voluntarily caring about the countryside and hasn't the faintest idea what to do about it. And now I've got 12 people on a Zoom call, 11 now, who think they know what to do. So we have a thing called the Future Building Standard. So we're talking buildings again, and a really serious problem called embodied carbon. And it quite bluntly says there, we're not going to deal with that because there's no agreed methodology. So the prospect of not dealing with the countryside because there is no agreed methodology is a really fearful one, really, because you're talking about bioregionalism and bioregioning, and I thought of presenting you to my panel of government and government advisors, saying, this is the future, it's bioregionalism. And after listening to you for 5 minutes, they'll say there is no agreed methodology. But it is something that is so important. I have a personal journey and a professional journey, and they come together at this point. It's really important. And I don't know how a message can, I mean, I spent, there's 8 pages of it heading your way, of saying it's important, but I'm advocating for something that I don't think is firm enough. It's like advocating for real or enlightened farming. It's not something that the system, the government and officials can grasp and take away and use. It's something which is nebulous, wonderful, spiritual, and at the same time, essential. And I don't know who out, apart from looking at the 11 good men and true women, who is going to advocate in a way that it is something that they authorities can take on board or will it always be some alternative universe? And I'm just advocating for something that isn't possible. I don't know, it's just a real quandary. So that's my story, I'm afraid.
So I think you're pointing to something really crucial here. So just to give you an example, so the Food Farming and Countryside Commission have decided that Devon is going to be an exemplar of how they create a land use framework and make decisions based on a new land use framework. So we think we're out there on a hiding to nothing, but anyway, but what they're coming up against is that there are multiple ways in which you can quantify and analyze different ways in which you could use land or in which land is being used. And this kind of group that's working in Devon organized a Zoom meeting not very long ago, to which Jane and I went. And we were in a breakout room. Well, I was in a breakout room with a person who's the head of the NFU, the National Farming Union for Devon. And he was saying, well, if you don't put farmers at the center of this new framework, they're just not going to be interested. When you think, if you come at it from the perspective of a farmer, say, you've got all these different constraints being imposed on you, whether it's elms or whether it's a new kind of payments for biodiversity increase or whatever it might be. There are multiple frameworks. And I think if we're going to make an impact as bioregionalists in kind of coming up with a bioregioning framework, it's got to be elegant and simple and able to absorb the other frameworks. So what Paul and I are doing at the moment is not necessarily creating another framework for investment in landscape scale regeneration. It's more like the back end thinking. So I'm thinking, well, maybe it's the back end thinking that we need to influence and not so much all the existing frameworks and complexity of legislation that's out there. I don't know, that's a bit of a kind of waffle. Anthony?
Well, I'm just thinking that it could be really valuable if we can get, goodness, what's his name? The Yadvinder and his project in the Environmental Change Institute, using bioregions as the framework for his nature recovery program, because he's trying to use Oxfordshire as a pathfinding example, and I think we could get, there's a serious possibility of getting that turned into the Thames Headwaters bioregion. And I think that's something that could get listened to if it comes out. So anyway, we're not going to get any traction from him till about September, but we're not going to stop trying.
Jump in, John.
John.
Just to say that this is such an important thing that we're discussing, even if it's not a single thing. So I completely understand what Daniel has explained. If we don't offer a kind of well thought out method or process or framework, then the system can't deal with it. On the other hand, there's a large number of people who say that the attempt to turn things into methods and systems is at the heart of our problems, and therefore we shouldn't do it. And I don't, of course, have a simple answer to that question, except that there's another urgent or parallel opportunity for this discussion in Scotland, where there's this big and very lively discussion about basically offsetting and net zero and biodiversity offsetting schemes, which right at this moment is attracting people from all over the world with lumps of money to buy up chunks of Scotland and to use the adding natural biodiversity as part of calculating they do. And I just think that, and there's a very big demand from the financial people, we need metrics so that we can attract more of this money, which will come in if we can give them a kind of clear framework for measuring the success of their renaturing or their rewilding. And of course, it also attracts a large number of cowboys and bad dealers. So it's like a fight, but it's not an academic fight at all. It's happening right now. And whoever, I think, convenes a discussion called how do we deal with the demand for metrics and the demand for measurement in a kind of way that doesn't kind of split us into artificial camps. I think that discussion does need to be held. How, I don't know, but it's very pertinent.
Very good. Claire.
So, I mean, I think your list was relevant. All of the points you made were relevant to me, and I mean, we've talked about this endlessly in this group in very interesting ways, but we haven't got a USP for bioregioning, and we're not likely to get one anytime soon. So my answer to that, although I haven't achieved it yet, is to tell the best story ever of what we're doing in order to pull people in. And I'm very determined to work out ways to do that. And Isabel's already come up with, you know, the River Dart stuff and your Parliament of Waters and all that kind of stuff, is if we can tell the most compelling story ever about what we're doing, hopefully that necessity for the 3 USPs and the sort of mega metrics that everyone's fighting over will slightly recede, because your heart will just be pulled into this and you'll want to be part of it. So that's my only methodology at the moment, because it's very complicated stuff. And if I went in and started talking to people saying, well, you know, you could problematize it this way or that way or the other way, everyone would just bugger off, frankly, and go and do something else.
Well said, Claire.
Yeah.
Christopher.
Whenever I attend one of these meetings, I come away feeling like I've got a bit of a split personality, because we are talking about something that sort of feels like it's sitting on the other side of the what do you call it, the Alice in Wonderland mirror. Anyway, so something that you need to go through to access, and our conversation seems to talk about how do you take the essence of what's through that mirror, that looking glass, and bring it back into this system so that people can see it and want to go through the looking glass into this other world. And Ella, you were talking about sort of leaving behind, you know, the pieces of what we've created here necessarily to be able to move into perhaps this bioregionalism. From my perspective, through my lens, I mean, I'm just talking about this little community here, and we talk about this all the time. How do you get people to step outside of the systems that control them, such that they can have the kinds of conversations that lead to these concepts, where they can find bioregionalism and the concept of a bioregion and find that, oh wow, that actually fits into this piece that perhaps is sitting in the back of my head that's never really been able to have a piece because it doesn't fit into the systems that I frequent on my everyday. So as I'm listening to all of this, and I'm listening to you, the looking glass piece is a really important piece, because it's what we're trying to find is, what is that thin layer of beauty that we have to walk through? How do you define that? How do you bring people through it? And I have the same problem here with speaking with people, you know, getting deeper conversations. It's a problem. But that would be my addition. I don't know really well. I think I'm probably saying everything that everyone else is saying. But anyway, I'll shut up.
Oh, that was very good. Through the looking glass. Richard.
Yeah, I just wonder if there's a bit where going through the looking glass isn't necessary. So I wanted to return to something Anthony said about how in Oxfordshire there's this idea for a multi-million or £billion, whatever it is, concrete flood defence system. And yet it's very well established that creating wetlands can, or you know, planting woodlands upstream and so on, can do it at a fraction of the price. So what is it about the way our governments make their decisions that mean they prioritize those things? And I think it's because they're used to habitually pulling certain levers, as they might call them. They know how many jobs that might create, and it's a nice big shiny infrastructure project they can point to, like maybe currently the whole nuclear thing. So I think what I'd like to know is, how do they get to make the decision to do the concrete build when they know the natural route works and would create green jobs and would train us into a healthy future?
Money, money, money. Is there a big company that's going to get it in its back pocket? That doesn't happen when you do tree planting on the Little Stock Brook.
Sure, but if we could be in that room, that space.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I'm just pointing out we've got 7 minutes left. Do people want to go over, or should we just try and crunch all this into 7 minutes?
Actually, so lovely to see you.
Goodbye, Anthony. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
Take care.
Yeah, I really must get going too. But
Okay, fine.
Brilliant,
We'll only keep going for 7 minutes. Paul.
Yeah, just briefly, Richard. Oh, shame you went. I thought Richard had done a great job with the circle of parishes around our city, in helping them understand what the potential of looking at the resources we have and supporting natural cycles are in terms of, a future economy, because we now have a partner in that group of parishes, the so-called Bathhaven Forum, which we're working with together as in regenerative practice terms, a proximate whole. So this kind of raises another question about, so there's kind of, the social process that we have to go through in order for people to say, aha, now there you put your finger on, that's exactly, the frame that works for the current dilemmas. But the other piece is that sometimes a watershed is very, very large. And, we're trying to wrestle with, what's the manageable bit that people can relate to beyond the cities, such that we can find a role for the city to develop and be able to bring into being a new kind of economy. So we found that as a very useful, though it's a political boundary, actually it kind of encompasses quite a useful area in terms of where these, for example, market gardens used to be and orchards used to be sited. And then that itself sits in a wider whole, the bioregion. I think that's probably going to be more understandable and more graspable as a way of bringing these ideas onto the table. Thank you.
One thing I want to name, this nature of what we're doing, bioregioning. Often it's holding paradox. It's being able to kind of hold two opposing views at the same time, or being able to think globally and locally, or being able to say it's all about data, but no, it's all about stories as well. And I think that that's kind of the space a lot of us find ourselves in. I mean, certainly we do here in Devon, and we call it the muddy middle. So it's also the space between citizens and policymakers, or the space between Southwest Water and climate activists, or it's this kind of reconciling space. So I think it's, as much as anything else, it's a process, and it's a function, if you like, to be in this bioregioning space. So it's a dynamic process. It's not necessarily working towards a single end state. It's a process of reconciling and mediating and all of that.
Yeah, beautifully said.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I mean, just for the sake of time, we only had one more slide, but I think you've kind of pulled out everything that was in our sort of list of conclusions. But really kind of the things we wanted to say was that actually the kind of fluidity rather than the rigidity is what's productive, is staying with those conversations, and the ability for bioregional thought to kind of force you into those conversations and live in that muddy middle is really productive. And yeah, I mean, the last thing that I want to say, because Sam wrote it and I thought it was very beautiful, was that there's lots of ideas and frameworks that we find useful, but the work is a dance, not a playbook, which I thought was lovely. So yeah, thank you so much. And I'll send the recording, if it's all right, to Sam as well, so that he can see your responses. And I've been trying to keep track of what's going off in the chat as well, but that was really, really helpful to us. So thank you so much.
Well, if there's anything else we can do to help you, please let us know. It's amazing what you're doing. Thank you.
Will you eventually produce reports so we can see what everyone else is saying about bioregions?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we'll add some colour to it as well. Like I say, this is kind of just our initial reflections. But what we want to do is kind of map out a bit more of the sort of like geographical differences,
Yes.
as well as the kind of critiques, because what we thought the helpful thing we could do is say, like, this is what we think the landscape of bioregional thought looks like, so that if people are coming to this idea, they can say, well, this is where I think I might fit into it.
Yes.
And these are the critiques that really resonate with me, and actually I want to stay away from that, or you know, whatever it is. Because what we're hoping is that what we're saying now is really obvious to all of you, but that it maybe prompts you to think as well. Like, hopefully it kind of really resonates, but also makes you kind of engage with it on a conceptual level as well. But yeah, so we are going to produce some form of writing, which will hopefully not just be an academic format, so that everyone can access it.
In terms of public bodies, Ella, you know, one of the challenges is governance over public money. So, you know, how that governance process works is also very key.
Yes, definitely. And that will be very different in the different places as well.
Congratulations, Maria, Johnny and Ella. You've done a fantastic job. Yeah. And it's also really valuable to have something reflected back to you when you're in the work and you're kind of doing it up close. To have people who are able to kind of get the big overview and step back and then show you what you're doing. That's so valuable.
Well, thank you for having us.
Well, I hope you'll come back. Come back when you've done the rest of your reporting.
Oh, we will.
Okay, good. So the next meeting we have in May, Paul and I are proposing to share our straw man with you. So you can pull it to pieces, we hope. And then beyond that, we need to find or choose a couple of people to be with us in June and July. So we need a few more suggestions about people we could approach to come along to our meetings. If anyone's got any ideas, please do email it round to the group, and I will get on the case, or you can get on the case. There's a kind of standard introduction email that we write to people to say, would you be prepared to come and share what you're doing with us, or, you know, just tell us about this or whatever. Great. Well, lovely to see you all.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you so much, everyone. And
thanks, everyone. Thanks,
and Maria and Johnny again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
see
I'll
you
get
all.
this put on the website. I'll get the recording put on the website.
Thank you so much, everyone. Speak to you
Bye.
soon.
Bye.
Cheers. Take care.